Welcome. Another episode, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. The topic today, as you can see from the description in the show notes, is Honus Wagner. And it's more about the player than the capital T, capital H, capital E card, the T206 Wagner, which is the most famous and notorious card in our industry, the most valuable. But Honus Wagner was a player as well. It's not just, he wasn't an obscure player that just happened to have the rarest card. He was an amazing player. So I want to unpack both of those from my perspective. But first, got sponsors: Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, COMC, and Beckett Media, including Beckett Authentication and Beckett Grading. The Wagner card, I can get Chris Ivey on here, talk about Heritage. They're not the only auction house that has dealt with that card. I had a episode about Dan Dishley, the founding editor and publisher of The Trader Speaks, which was the key hobby publication when I got in the hobby, and he actually had handled I think it passed through his hands. I don't know that he was holding on to him for a long time, but he was an intermediary. He was in the thick of things back in those days. So he actually handled 3 Wagners, and just like everything else, when I look back at the early days of the hobby, it would have been smart to never sell anything that was good, because the prices have gone up by 10,000%. That's 100x for those of you who are doing that math. So, but Honus Wagner was a player actually in my boardroom here, where I have some of these hobby dinners occasionally. I've got a painting, and it's the least identifiable of the paintings. I've got paintings of Ruth and Gehrig and obviously Roberto Clemente, several Clemente images. But in my little art gallery there, they say, who's that guy that has the P on the cap? And sometimes they'll guess, but it's not, they don't always guess it. And he just doesn't look, he looks, well, he just doesn't look like he is one of the best players of all time. But he looks powerful. He's stocky, but it's more of a head and shoulders shot. Chris Ivey, when we were joking about his auction and all the amazing stuff he had, he just said that he has I don't think it's his rule, but he just said every Wagner, whenever we get it, it seems to go for more than the one in that condition from before. So it's been an amazing investment for anybody that held one. There's a lot of bragging rights as well as appreciation. I remember back in the day when I was single in the 70s, and I'd go to card shows all around the country. And this was in the formative years. They just were great shows, more like in hotels than in convention centers. And there'd always be a hospitality room, it seemed, where you'd go up to some party room or something in the hotel. And the guys would gather, there'd be pizza and beer and stuff like that. And you just stay up until the wee hours of the night. I probably could do just a separate episode on that. So there were couches in there and chairs, and you just, it'd be 400 square feet or something. And there'd be 20 or 30 guys in there, and you just talk about the good old days. And of course, this is in the 70s. What are the good old days? Well, the good old days were in the 60s and 50s and 40s and 30s. And again, I was the young guy. I was in my 20s. So, but one of the frequent conversations that came up is the Honus Wagner card. Even in the 70s, it had that notoriety. And there were more than one time, I remember guys, again, older than me, going around the room, and these were veteran, iconic dealers, because the hobby wasn't as big at that time, and everybody kind of knew everybody. They basically could go around and put together they could identify by name where the 45 or 50 Wagners were at that time. And so that's why I think some of these estimates of being 60 or 70 of the Wagners, that's probably, 60 I think is based on my experience, would be a number that I would say 60 is a solid number. But they were talking about who had them, how they got them. It was just fascinating, and I wish I'd turned on a tape recorder. But Honus Wagner's a player, was a fabulous player. I'm a kind of a loyal, faithful guy, and so I really appreciate it when a player spends virtually his whole career with one team. And so Honus Wagner's a pirate. Even though Roberto Clemente started off in the Dodger organization, he's a pirate. He was, in the Dodgers farm system. In fact, they tried to hide him, but Honus Wagner was a terrific player. He was when they had the first Hall of Fame election, he was actually the second highest vote getter. So Ty Cobb was first. Honus Wagner was second. Babe Ruth was third. So in many cases, in those days, Wagner was considered the better all-around player than Ruth. I disagree, but I can see that he played a demanding position, shortstop, very, very well. And so he was a great hitter. He's thought to be just not a singles hitter, but he won the batting title 8 times, which is, again, against your peers, you have the highest average. That says a lot. But what's not as well known is that he actually led the league in slugging percentage 6 times, which is not just home runs. It's basically the total bases. But, so he had a lot of doubles, lots of triples. He was a fast runner, and he led the league in stolen bases 5 times. So again, the all-around aspect. Ruth, I'm still voting for Babe Ruth, partly because he just had an amazing pitching record. He probably could have made the Hall of Fame as a pitcher. And he doesn't look like he'd be a great base stealer, but I think he stole home more than any other guy. So he's just an amazing, and Babe Ruth changed the game. So, and again, a slugger that hit more home runs than the rest of the league combined. So, my point is, if Honus Wagner in some of those days in that time was considered even better than Ruth, how amazing did he have to be? He had these huge hands. He was a Hulk, looking kind of a guy, except he kind of had bow legs. I mean, they would talk about that. The fable or the story is that the scarcity of the Wagner is based on one of 2 theories. One that maybe Wagner didn't smoke. He didn't really want, or he didn't think it was good for young boys to be smoking and to promote kid smoking. He didn't approve of that. And the other is that perhaps he wasn't paid. Or he wasn't paid, or he was paid. He probably was pretty much at the top of his game at the time when the T206s were coming out in the late 1908, 9, 10, 11. So at the top of his game, he would have been a guy that would be preeminent, and he may not have gotten paid and said, "Hey, stop the presses. I don't want my card to be released. You didn't pay me for it. You didn't pay me enough, or I don't approve of the kid smoking, or I don't smoke," any of those things. Interestingly, he is the first athlete that ever endorsed a bat for Louisville Slugger. And that was in 1905. So predating T206s, Honus Wagner has an endorsement deal with Louisville Slugger, the first player to do that. So he had to be somewhat savvy about the value of his name. And again, that feeds into the theory that he wasn't paid or he wasn't paid enough. Bill James, whom I greatly respect, who's one of my contemporaries, and I think he just retired, so he's pretty close to my age and my vintage. When he was coming up, I was coming up, and I loved his. I mean, I really got some of his early books, and even though I'm more of a classically trained statistician, he was he had a lot of excellent statistical insights. Well, he says that Wagner's 1908 season is possibly the greatest single season in baseball history, and because he's comparing to when he did what he did, it has to be compared to the times and to the baselines of what the other people in the league were doing. Just like Babe Ruth is I don't know if it was 1920 or one of those years where he had as many home runs as the rest of the league put together. Well, that's just amazing. Well, Wagner had something like that, except not with home runs, but his slugging and RBIs and all the stuff that he did was so far above the league standard and average that Bill James thinks that was the greatest season in history. Again, that's a year or two before T206s are getting going. Does Wagner get appropriate hobby respect other than his T206 card? I actually don't think. Well, he's starting to get more. He's starting to get more respect. Interestingly, he's not on that many T cards compared to his contemporaries. Again, he's in that in-between age, but he's on lots of E cards, and he's one of the more valuable. I think he's probably would fall behind Cobb, but maybe not anybody else. But 2 cards that I remember growing up and being as a young collector, that one again, it's another reveal. Actually, my dad had the 40 play ball Wagner high number. And so again, Dad, if you're listening, I'm just coming clean on that. So, but he's a coach then. He doesn't look formidable. He doesn't look like a greatest player of all time. He looks like kind of an old guy. And then also what I picked up later, not from my dad, but in a collection back in the 70s, is his 48 Leaf. And that he just doesn't look very inspiring there. He's an older guy. He's got the tobacco chaw, I think, and he's a coach, and he just doesn't look formidable. He doesn't look like, wow, I'd be really afraid if this guy came to the plate. And so again, he was retired by, I think maybe he retired in 1919 or somewhere in there. So again, just really hard to figure out how great he was when you can't see a lot of, there's not as much video and stuff that you can see. This guy was amazing. You look at his stats and all that. Again, these are my opinions. If you disagree, you're welcome to email me at drjamesbeckett@gmail.com. Always enjoy feedback. I've got, I guess the various sponsors have interest in Wagner as a card. No person would turn it down. A question that each person might have is, and it depends on your, not status in life, but your socioeconomic status, I guess, is that if you had a Wagner, what would you do with it? I guess if you had financial needs, you probably won't have financial needs anymore. You could sell it. Any auction house, Heritage would be, like I said, they're one of my sponsors, but they're not necessarily the best, but there's nobody better. But Huggins and Scott would say, hey, let us auction that off as well. So you'd have the choice of any auction house you'd want to auction it off. You'd probably want to get it graded, and I think, in spite of my fondness for BGS, I believe most of the Wagners are graded by PSA. Perhaps SGC has some, and but again, I'm not sure very many have been BGS or BVG back in the day. But you definitely want to get it graded and authenticated in that way, and then you could sell it. And I'd probably recommend getting it graded, even if you're going to keep it, just because you'd have the protection that it wouldn't get messed up, and you wouldn't want to leave it out in the sun. You'd want to protect it, but you'd probably want to show it. The problem is, if you show it, it's so valuable it can be temptation for thieves, so then you'd have to insure it, and the insurance would have to be special, and again, it's a problem I would love to have, and probably you would love to have. So it's nice to dream. I have said that I was the underbidder at a pennies on the dollar compared to what it'd be now, but I was the underbidder on a Wagner in an auction many decades ago. And again, I've had other good deals, but that probably not bumping up my bid a little bit higher. Again, not a lot of regrets in life, but that perhaps is one of them. Again, thanks for letting me reminisce about Wagner, and when I see the painting that's out in my boardroom, and people comment on it, I'll direct them to this episode. So thanks for your attention. Appreciate your listening, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another episode about something else. Thanks.